Thank you, John, and thank you to the IHF for organizing this talk. The timing is fortuitous because actually there is an exhibition that we've set up in association with the Whitechapel Gallery, which is actually called the Utopian Stage, the Festival of Arts, Shiraz-Persepolis. And the show there at the Whitechapel Gallery, we're showing what I have been able to put together so far from the archives of the festival. This will come up again and again because probably a lot of you know that the archives are not accessible. So even though there are probably documents saved which are in the ex-National Iranian Radio and Television archives, I haven't been able to access them, and I don't think anybody else has. So the question of the ban and the censorship is a big issue that overshadows the understanding and the legacy of the festival itself. But on show, I put together a set of the annual catalogs that I've been able to collect, which are extremely valuable because they contain the information that none of us have to hand at the moment. There are photographs of some of the performances. There are bulletins. These were published daily. So during the more or less 10 days that the festival happened every year, there would be bulletins that would have interviews, essays, comments, as well as notices for maybe improvised events that would have been happening the next day. There are some film and audio pieces that I've recovered. And then there's the posters associated with the festival. The whole project is part of the Archaeology of the Final Decade. This is a platform I put together, which is a curatorial and educational platform, and it aims to raise awareness about the artistic material and conditions of the 60s and 70s at the moment in Iran. What I'm dealing with, for example, here, are material that have remained obscure. They're underexposed, they're maybe overlooked. In some cases, they've been removed from circulation and even destroyed. But I think they're highly significant. So the aim of this archaeological platform is to reincorporate them into discourse and to reevaluate their cultural and intellectual values. Now, why animate the archive? At this moment, I think we're at a very exciting place where many people are working on our archives and looking to document their own histories. This is something that many filmmakers, writers, artists, curators are doing in tracing their own pasts. New art histories are being written, and the aim is to fill in the gaps. What is really interesting is that what we are doing here is away from the traditional forces, so to speak, that externally we are now working away from the outsider's gaze. So people like myself are looking to define and evaluate the definitions of their own cultures. And the very notion of the global is being defined, and we're looking at perspectives and counterpoints these days, which are not coming from the traditional centers. And internally, of course, we are counteracting the damages of censorship or amnesia. These have played a big and significant role in creating these gaps. Due to the absence of archives, scholarship to date about this particular topic, the Festival of Arts, Shiraz-Persepolis, remains pitifully poor. The archive, in this case, I think is particularly valuable because the material culture that was on show during those 11 years, of course, being performance is ephemeral. So the non-materiality of the artistic content makes it even more important for us to trace and document whatever we can of those years and those events. The non-materiality, of course, of the art object here also makes it non-commodifiable. So unlike the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art, which was also controversial at its time, with similar arguments played against it, especially its inappropriateness in the conditions of Iran, the socio-political conditions of Iran at the time, I think there are very few people who would not acknowledge its importance today. But of course, what we have here at the Shiraz is the eventness of the event, and that's very difficult to put a value on in that sense, a fiscal value at least. What we want to propose by doing this kind of work is that we want to, I'd like to retrieve these objects from obscurity, insert them back into cultural memory, and I'd like to venture across the fault lines and to create new channels of connectivity and communication, to be reconstructive and restorative in an intracultural dialogue, in a dialogue which is of us about ourselves. This archaeological investigation is not just a digging down to bring out the material, but is also an expansive one horizontally to look at the ideas and the intellectual drives behind them, their positions socially and historically, even legislatively in some cases. Hopefully exposure and evaluation will go some way in demystifying and demythologizing these historical objects and shedding some light on the cultural and historical landscape and the intellectual milieu of the recent past. I think it's important to embrace the difficulties and to begin to accept multiple readings of things, to complexify the readings. The effort here is not to sort of simplify the dynamics at play, either in respect, in this case, of aesthetic or cultural genealogies, but it's not a project to set a record straight. The aim is not to resolve, so to speak, but to complexify our understanding of the material. But in doing so, we must break away from hitherto accepted truths, dichotomous and binary definitions of the right and the wrong, and the appropriate and inappropriate, to allow a retrospective and critical analysis of these highly complex forces that were at play. We need to allow ourselves to not throw out the baby with the bathwater. For me, the reopening of these archives is very important, because if the closure, the removal of the historical archive annotated a kind of a closure, its reopening is to facilitate and motivate new value production, both symbolically and materially, and also a new understanding for ourselves. As Iranians, I think we know very well that cultural memory is highly enduring and at the same time very short-lived. In introduction, I want to say that the space of the festival, as John pointed out, is and was and is a contested space, and that's what is interesting. The annual Jasn Honar Shiraz, or the Festival of Art Shiraz-Persepolis, remains, despite the passage of more than half a century, a highly contested and contentiously unresolved artistic territory. It is definitely overcast by mythologies and the politics of blame. It represents one of the most controversial trajectories of cultural attitude and policy, and intellectual contact in modern, intercultural contact in modern Iranian history. That's an open Iran to the rest of the world, looking at the rest and bringing the rest into itself. And it is a lasting and unresolved artistic complex, which we have inherited from the pre-revolutionary period. The festival divided the Iranian intellectual community then, and it continues to do so now. And it's in a way that more than any other officially endorsed cultural project of that era. So I think contestation and controversy have weighed down the festival during its life, and now in the absence of information and archives, they continue to be associated with it until the present. It's important to say that some of these contestations, of course, were politically, well, they were all politically charged, but some of them were religiously charged. But also, we had at the secular ends of the spectrum, we had issues with the festival then. Paradoxically, though, outside of the Iranian national landscape, the very liberal attitudes of the festival were very much of interest in an international context. Outside of the political and cultural sensitivities of the Iranians, the festival is recognized as one of the most uniquely transformative intercultural experiences of any festival, perhaps the most radical, multidisciplinary crucible of any commissioning festival in history. And commissioning is important because the Festival of Arts in Shiraz-Persepolis was a commissioning festival. Many events happened only there and because it was there. And this is a very unique quality and characteristic of the festival. I can briefly say something about looking closer at the political sociology of Iran at the time. It underscores an important phenomenon. I think that the transcendent utopianism and the cosmopolitanism that characterized the intellectual project at Shiraz-Persepolis did not correlate with the dominant political discourses that engaged large segments of the intellectual polity in Iran at the time. The conventional political formulations that dominated and radicalized the national space in the late 60s and 70s in Iran were mainly driven by nativist impulses. I would personally call the Festival of Arts Shiraz-Persepolis itself an exemplary example of a nativist project on one level. But those political discourses were responses to the essential questions of the time, that is to say, those of nationalist independence, anti-imperialism, and indigenous alternatives, while underlying post-colonial impulses of nativism and the ideas of returning to the self, they did resonate with the core thinking of the festival itself. The festival articulates nativism and the need to return to ourselves very, very often. But the festival, I believe, had a qualitatively and markedly different interpretation and approach to cultural nationalism. Its utopian proposition was of a transnational aesthetic dialogue. It was markedly more complex, and it was non-concordant with those essentially sectarian, dogmatic, contemporaneous attitudes, especially on the left in politics, which was more stuck, for lack of a better word, in a binary standoff and sometimes some simplistic short-sightedness, where it failed to appreciate that if there were an economy of prestige at play in this place, at this festival of cultural negotiations, then it would be most safely placed amongst the forces of the peripheral, the third world, as it was called, the dissenting, I would say, the unorthodox for sure, the counterculture in many cases, mostly the outsiders, especially when it came to the third world. The left attitude did, at that instance, I believe, fail to condone the very radical third world writing back, which was, I believe, the dominant dynamic in action here in the landscape of the festival. And it was consciously articulated by the organizers and the directors of the festival as very much a post-colonial proposition. I think the dogmatic sectarianism and the radical ideas in those political views failed to respond to the festival on its own terms. Therefore, I have come to call the festival as a space that operated as an autonomous space. I think those attitudes didn't just inhibit any acknowledgement of the festival as an autonomous, liberal, and modern, both very important concepts, space. It simply failed to recognize it. So in summary, I just want to say, before I go into the festival itself, that taking the decade-long controversial Festival of Arts Shiraz-Persepolis as a historical object, The aim is to critically evaluate its distinct topography, its vision, and its practice. I propose 5 or 6 bullet points. I'm very interested to discuss that I believe it operated within a modern condition. What do I mean by that? That it proposed and defended heterogeneity, pluralism, and individuality, which I think are intrinsic to the modern condition. This is the system within which the festival itself operated, and it aimed to bring a unity of disunities, and it was not afraid to let any of the old demarcation to melt away. I think it functioned within a democratic model of culture. What do I mean by that? It certainly was a liberal space. It was a liberal space within the restrictive political reality of Iran itself, and as well the conventional cultural terrain of Iran at the time. It was an edifying and it had an edifying and educational attitude. It was definitely very geared towards the young, the new generation, the burgeoning new middle classes of Iran, that actually, I would say, not the so privileged, towards the artists themselves, especially in promotion of dynamic exchange and growth. It's certainly anti-hierarchical, anti-hegemonic, and anti-authoritarian. I will discuss some of the performances in more detail, but it certainly set out to deconstruct the dichotomies of the local and the international, the colonized and the colonizer, even the pre-modern and the modern or postmodern, if we were talking about European and American spaces. The archaic was juxtaposed against the so-called advanced, the self against the other. It also did away with awards. It was a festival that decided to, after the second year, decided to do away with awards so that there will not be any sense of winning, hierarchy, anything to aspire to in any sense like that. Democracy also, for me, refers to a temporal and a spatial dimension, the democracy in time, such that the festival decided to include a wide spectrum of performances from across artistic, historical periods: ancient material, archaic, so-called primitive material, advanced, so-called avant-garde or neo-avant-garde expressions. It also operated this in the same way spatially by improvising alternative performance spaces. These were hardly traditional, conventional spaces. They happened across the city. They happened in nature. They happened, some of them were improvised. And possibly one of the weak points and the Achilles heel of the festival itself is its well-meaning attitude to democratize this space. Because of course, if you are proposing a highly unconventional set of ideas and you have a very particular agenda, I wouldn't call it elitist, but I may call it more of a niche area of work. If you're going to open it into space and if you're going to allow everyone to have access to it very easily, i.e. if you're going to think that just like the Tazier or performances that were happening in Italy at the time, where a lot of artists were interested in teatro en piazza, bringing it to the people, the idea of bringing it to the people, I believe is very close to the heart of the Shiraz organizers. But bringing it close to the people in a space like Iran can have its backlash. And I think it did. But this doesn't do away with the emancipated ideas that informed those kind of decisions. It's very important, thirdly, to recognize it as a radical, I would definitely call it radical, a third world rewriting. It was a post-colonial intellectual project, I would say, that was looking to expand the area of overlapping community between the metropolitan and the formerly colonized societies, the so-called third world facing its first world. Today we would call it south facing north, pretty much. It really proposed itself as a world stage And this really predated very much these ideas that were happening elsewhere. The Havana Biennial of Art in 1986, which is exactly 19 years later than the first Festival of Arts in Shiraz, articulates the same ideas, puts on the map traditional and archaic and tribal forms in a visual art context as equal, valid, and part of an intercultural dialogue in a biennial. It's very important to recognize that these ideas are much earlier in Shiraz. In terms of its radical third world rewriting, it focused on a cultural shift, both in production and in politics, towards what I will call the present moment, the decolonizing moment, and the re-emerging the other countries who are coming out of colonization. A lot of the certainly the Africans who performed at the festival were only enjoying independence for a maximum of 10 years at this time. Some of them came out of Africa for the first time to perform in an international, on an international platform. So it was very much against the European mission of civilizing, and it definitely highlighted the discourse of minorities. This stands in sharp contradiction to what I was led to believe when I only heard the gossips before I had a chance to study the material, that it was a West-toxicated project with money thrown at Western artists, etc. Of course, any look at the catalogs, the 11 catalogs, is just staggering to realize that about 3/4 of the performances that came on that stage came from Asia and Africa. I was looking and searching for all these Americans and Europeans who had exploited our oil money. It's important also, the next point is the Cold War. Iran, of course, was a significant peripheral player in that, against that fault line of the Cold War, but at the festival in Shiraz, all the Eastern European countries are represented, sometimes even as an opening ceremony of the festival. So this was also a very unusual space to allow an Eastern European, Western European dialogue across the ideological, in that case, boundary. I'm in no means saying that Shiraz is the only place doing these things. France was very active in engaging the third world, so engaging Africa. A lot of the thinkers and the personalities that were instrumental in the anti-colonial movements actually were educated in Europe, and they immigrated back to their own countries. But happening in France, I think, is very different to happening in Iran. And this is very significant. The other significant point about that is that, which I'm going to mention now, is that Shiraz proposes a universalist model, which I haven't found anywhere else significantly put to practice at that time. There were very major Pan-African movements. There were biennials of Arab art. There were biennials of art of the Mediterranean countries, but these were very regional. And I think the universalist attitude, the utopian universalist attitude, is in stark contrast to a sectarian nativism and a regional nativism. This is, I think, for me, a very, very, very important, and is a very complex idea that I think, even though the festival in some ways becomes implicitly enters a dialogue with intercultural, contemporaneous regional iterations, like, as I said, the World Festival of Negro Arts in Dakar, 1966, very similar timing. The Pan-African Cultural Festival in Algiers, it only survived 1 year, 1969. It's been done recently in the 2000s, actually. So the longevity of the festival is also very important to note. Now, the background of the festival itself. It was an annual festival staged from 1967 to 77. It was held in and around the city of Shiraz, as most of you know, in venues such as the ruins of Persepolis and Nakhsh Rostam, the Kabe Zartosht. It organized many, many concerts and poetry readings, etc., at Hafeziyeh, the shrine to Hafez, Saray Moshir, the Naranjistan Garden, Bagh Delgosha, the Delgosha Garden, the television studio in Shiraz, and various university halls and sports stadium, as well as, of course, the street, nature, mountains, Haftan. It was broad. It was inaugurated on the 11th of September 1967. The first performance was by the National Iranian Television Chamber Orchestra, conducted by Vahe Khochayan, with a soprano, Iranian soprano, Nasrin Azarmi, who went on to perform in Europe as well. One of the pieces that opened that first festival was by the Iranian Mortaza Hannaneh, and it was a world premiere for Hannaneh's piece. The festival came to an end on the 22nd of August 1977, exactly 10 years later. Again, an Iranian performance, Iranian traditional music this time, also National Iranian Radio and Television, organized by the Center for the Preservation and Propagation of Music, Markaz Hifz o Esha'eh Musiqi. The Talayi Ensemble, headed by Dariush Talayi, also on the tar, organized this last performance, and Parisa was the vocalist on that occasion. The general shape of the festival, I've counted that it involved over 311 performances of music, dance, theater performance, as well as film over the 11 years. 60 of these were devoted solely to Iranian classical and traditional music. This is 60 of the 311. That is very sizable. It's a very, very important point, because the Festival of Art Shiraz-Persepolis has become known for all kinds of other things, but actually music is one of the most important elements of this festival, and Iranian music is the most performed genre throughout the 11 years. So for anyone who thinks it's all about the West. It branched out into various other iterations, including poetry reading. It happened in the initial stages of the festival, visual arts exhibitions, carpet exhibition, handicraft exhibitions, and all various peripheral activities and exhibitions. Many of the exhibitions, no, actually I would probably say most of these events were recorded. Recording them was very, very important, because the National Iranian Radio and Television was not only the sponsor of the exhibition, but would create programs that would be broadcast later on television and film for the wider public. Again, the attitude of democratizing it and opening it to the wider public was very much part of this whole program. There were many publications, this is very important, and the idea of copyright and affording, crediting and acknowledging the rights of the creators and the artists was taken very seriously in a space in Iran that still is struggling to organize this at the moment. The aims, they were stated as celebration of the classical and traditional national art forms, which relates to the nativism I was talking about, lifting of cultural standards in Iran. It's the emancipatory drive to catapult Iran into a different place, to put creative talents of Iranian artists on the map, i.e. the promotion of national creativity, introducing Iranian art forms to the international artistic community, opening up Iran to the rest of the world, introduction of world artists to Iranian audiences, which was the educational and edifying attitude of the festival towards the local landscape in Iran, updating Iranian audiences with that which was progressive in the cultural realm of the rest of the world. This statement, these are stated in the original aims of the festival, published. It continues to say, very interestingly, that European travel, as well as participation in international artistic events and festivals, is open to some individuals, but these opportunities are not available to many. It is our responsibility, they think, to organize festivals such as these in our country to provide the possibility and opportunity for the public to become aware of cultural trends around the world. On the one hand, it is vital that our own art forms are made available to our own younger generations as well as to the rest of the world, and far beyond the few Iranologists, they call it, and the specialists of the field. So I think they were very, very clear about what they were trying to do and who the festival was geared towards. It was masterminded by a coalition, a small coalition of like-minded cultural practitioners led by the visionary Reza Qutbi, who had become the director of the National Iranian Radio and Television. Farrokh Ghaffari, who had returned from work at the Cinematheque in France, and Khojeste Kia, who was educated at the Old Vic here in London and led the theatre research at the NIRT. These people got together with the endorsement of Shahbanu Farah Pahlavi. The NIRT, National Iranian Radio Television, was the official sponsor of the festival, and the Ministry of Culture had little to do with the festival as far as I can see, and that was headed by Pahlbod at the time. I find this a very interesting situation where it's not so much a state within a state, but there are very different cultural attitudes and drives at play here. It's very important to understand that everything was not just blanket controlled in one way. Under the open-minded leadership of Reza Qutbi, the sponsorship of the festival by the National Iranian Radio Television ensured its relative autonomy from the main state apparatus, and it did protect its liberal space from official and ministerial repressions. I would go as far as saying intelligence controls as well. This was, of course, further strengthened by the endorsement of the Shahbanu, who took the project under her patronage. This autonomy quickly became a thorn in the side of the zealously paranoid intelligence service. I think this certainly was not known to me when I first started doing this investigation, which considered the festival and its liberal space a chancing game, an opportunity for dissenting artistic expression. It's very interesting because I think the content, the ideas, and the format of how the festival functioned was very much out of the reach of that kind of censorship and that kind of control. The improvising style of a lot of these performances, as you can see here, for example, the non-textual performances, and just to go back to the eventness of the event, how do you control, how do you censor that moment, the relationship between the audience and a public is not so easily done. So I'm going to jump to why Shiraz, to be a stage of the world and for the world, was very much the motto and the raison d'etre of the festival. This was, of course, symbolically exploited by the choice of Persepolis as a main stage of the festival. Obviously, a ceremonial meeting place of cultures and nations from a bygone era. It holds very romantic and nationalistic aspirations, and these are not untransparent. Nevertheless, it's obvious to any theatrical practitioner and anybody interested in performance that the monumentality of these ruins and the raw and epic grandiosity of the nature behind provides an undeniably evocative non-stage to behold. Grand and rugged, structured and deconstructed, it's exuberant, it's free, and is a far cry from the traditions and the poverty of a black box or a traditional form of so-called European theater. These kind of performances, these kind of festivals were even happening in the Middle East, in Lebanon. Baalbek itself was already running at that time, and it had been a source of inspiration for the Iranians at the time when they decided to choose Persepolis. I've also discussed the other choices. I think Esfahan was another choice for this. But of course, Shiraz, as Ghaffari is quoted in saying, it's not only the land of the Achaemenids and the Sasanians, but it also stands for much of our poetry, and it also had a very significant school of painting. And the climate came into it, and of course the hospitable charms and the sensibilities of the local population in Shiraz. Isfahan was a serious contender, but one very, very good reason for Isfahan is that some of its most glorious monuments that they wanted to employ are religious. And Shiraz provided a different environment where there were gardens, shrines, and ruins that didn't have that religious charge, so it did make more sense to do it there as well. The stimulation and oxygenation of the local reality, I think is very important. We have to realize is one of the main intellectual drives and behind what was articulated at the festival. Within the local context, two main aims were clearly defined. No volume of investment, sponsorship, and residencies abroad, something we see quite often these days as well, could have the same effective impact as that of creating an actual base for intercultural exchange at home. I interviewed many people who, from artists, practitioners, etc., who told me that when they were being sent abroad for scholarships, etc., in those days they were being sent by their family, with their families, and a translator. And I spoke to officials who said how difficult that was to maintain, I mean, in terms of the costs, and a year, and that was only for one musician to go to Vienna, for example. So the idea of bringing the world inside of Iran was very, very much at the heart of what was happening, and it was mentioned before. The enthusiasts that this was aimed towards came mainly from the middle and the lower economic backgrounds, those who were less privileged in this kind of exposure to the international scene. Interviews I've conducted with these younger generation of festival goers, both as performers and as spectators, attest to this uniquely invaluable provision for growth, experience, exchange, and exposure. Performance artists such as, I'm going to name a few, Reza Abdo, Susan Dehim, Susan Taslimi, Shohre Aghdashlu, Mohammad Bagher Ghaffari, Attila Pesiani, these people and their colleagues belong to the generation who benefited from such an exposure. So I'm going to quote from the second Festival of Arts catalogue. From all over the world, artists and critics came to Shiraz for this festival to perform and pass judgment on a variety of musical and performing arts. Iranian music and theater were, of course, also represented. This gave Iranians an excellent opportunity to ponder on whether the state of their arts was on the same level of excellence as that of other countries, and whether Iran had succeeded in preserving its own traditional musical heritage, for example, as well as, say, India or Japan. Promotion of these art forms locally was a central aim, as I've mentioned, and encouragement of self-awareness, criticality, broadening the parameters of theory and practice and discourse inside of Iran were very central to this endeavor. The festival, I'm going to jump a bit. Yes, the festival made it one of its aims, very important here, to create a modern Iranian audience, a modern Iranian audience. I've spoken to many musicians, the older generation of musicians, who said that in the late 50s, they would literally hide their musical instrument if they were on public transport, because they were considered entertainments. They were told to play a little tune for people, that kind of thing. And Shiraz actually was very, very central in creating an audience, a modern audience for Iranian music inside of Iran, for people to sit and contemplate the music. The Indian component in the festival, which is the strongest after Iranian music, the Indian presence, it was very, very, very central in creating this kind of relationship, because the Indians had that kind of relationship with their audiences where they would sit and expect their audience to pay attention to the music. So I'm going to quickly talk about some things locally also. They gave a huge amount of importance to studying and staging ruhozi, a kind of commedia dell'arte style folkloric type of performance indigenous to Iran, and also the reconceptualization and reinterpretation of the previously banned tazieh performances. They were banned in 1933 by Reza Shah, part of its secularizing project. Most impressive, of course, is the music, the leadership of Shahrzad Afshar, the work of Fawzia Majd, Hormoz Farhat, Dr. Safat, and many others. In theater, the festival commissioned new innovations as well in Iranian theater. They were premiered, and these pivotal pieces were, for example, City of Tales, Shahr Qisse by Bijan Mofid, a seminal socio-critical play that I believe had been shelved by the Ministry of Culture just perhaps by neglect, and also creation by the writer Abbas Nalbandian that was directed by Arbi Ovanessian, which was called Research. Talents such as Parviz Sayyad, Bahram Beyzai, Izzatullah Intizami, Nusrat Karimi were among scores of others who performed. In film, the new and fledgling Iranian cinema found an ally and also gained a platform here. Taqvai, Shahid Sales, Mehrjoui, Golestan, Ovanessian were afforded visibility alongside auteurs such as Bergman, Buñuel, Antonioni, and others. New Iranian cinema was sanctioned in opposition, effectively, to what they call film farsi, the term that denotes the popular mainstream Iranian Bollywood-style productions that were proliferating. So independent Iranian cinema was strongly supported, and this also initiated entry onto the international scene for Iranian cinema practitioners at the time. Internationally, the festival articulated a paradigm-shifting arbitration in opposition to and beyond, this is quite complicated, authoritarian, hierarchical, and hegemonic Eurocentric model of culture, i.e. the dominant European or Euro-American culture of the time. It proposed what has hitherto been rejected and overlooked. In fact, a precociously profound and very sophisticated novel global model by introducing distant voices from Asia and Africa into the international cultural discourse and proposing them as equal. In doing so, it shifted the center of gravity of cultural production, as I said, towards the re-emerging other, and I would call it a kind of a third world rewriting and a very radical shift towards the present moment, as I said. In its critique of Eurocentrism and its affirmation of non-European sensibilities, it put these expressions juxtaposed with ones that were coming from experimentalists in America and Europe who were the neo-avant-garde. The process of discovery, deconstruction, and reorientation, it found a natural ally in this internationally fluid and subversive Western avant-garde, whose own modernities sought to break from the constraints and stabilities of their own tradition. Politically, it's very important to talk about the Cold War. The terrain of the festival was a vulnerable one, not just intellectually as we're talking, but also logistically. Internationally, it operated against the backdrop of the Cold War. And it was a very new proposition to work against that kind of a divide. So in a transnational way, in this crucible, it commissioned artists as far apart as Japan, Greece, Iran, France, Serbia, artists coming from Argentina. I mean, the whole world is involved in this project. Japanese no theater was staged outside of Japan. This was a rare occurrence at that time, alongside Rwandans and Ugandan dancers and percussionists, Balinese gamelan, Indian Kathak dancers, Uma Sharma, Yamini Krishnamurti, Shanta Rao. They were brought into dialogue with Maurice Béjart, Merce Cunningham, the Greek choreodrama, the Alvin Nicolai Company, Carolyn Carlson, Shuji Terayama's These are just names that might be familiar to some of you. Shuji Torayama's avant-garde theatrical creations, some were commissioned also by the festival. They were put on stage next to Polish theatrical practitioners like Kantor and Grotowski, who are now considered as giants of modern theatrical innovation. Next to Joseph Chaikin, the Romanian-born Andrei Sherban, Yanis Xenakis, who was a sworn communist himself, who had fled the Greek dictatorship, Olivier Messiaen, Bruno Maderna, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. In a recent interview that I did with Nuria Espert, the Spanish artist and director, she remarked that she found the relative freedom in Shiraz, she found, in fact, relative freedom in Shiraz from the dictatorial constraints of General Franco's Spain. It's very important to realize that at that time, part of Europe, Greece, Spain, and Portugal are under dictatorships. Eastern Europe is part of the, well, what they would have called the behind the Iron Curtain, so to speak. So this is the kind of, it's very important to also consider that moment in history overall. 1968 is the date that the United Kingdom took away the ban on theatrical play scripts. So until 1968, any play script had to be sent to the Lord Chamberlain to be checked, crossed, and then returned. The Royal Court Theatre that pioneered new writing in the UK was shut down on several occasions because it decided to stage a performance that had not gone through that censorship process, and this is 1968. So it's very important to understand all of this when we're looking back. I think I'm going to skip theory here a little bit and maybe look at some of the films that we want to show. So this band archive, it means that, for one thing, the Europeans and the Americans rise above everyone. So everybody talks about Stockhausen, Béjart, Merce Cunningham. You can name the rest, I'm sure. They are the ones that dominate the memory of the festival. But they are very much the minority expressions that happen in the festival. Important as they are, they became much more important past those years. In fact, they were quite marginal in their own countries. Merce Cunningham and his colleagues were not big in New York at the time. There was a push within American politics to promote those kind of expressions, but actually perhaps France at the time was playing a bigger role in exposing artists like them to the rest of the world. There were hippie movements. The Beatles were inviting Ravi Shankar to the Royal Albert Hall. There were lots of networks happening and forming at the time, and I think that's why Shiraz is so important when it happened and how it happened. And we have to bear it in mind that it did not happen in the so-called, well, not the so-called, but in the ex-colonizers' sphere of culture. Let's have, I mean, these are just things that we found. Some of the footage that we have in these films have been ripped off YouTube. You can find them. So they're not going to be good quality. There is a film that was produced called Sound of Trumpets, Sound the Trumpets, Beat the Drums, and this you have here, it is on YouTube as well. We have permission also to use it in the exhibition, parts of it, and parts of it here. So let's just have a look at what we have here. Should we turn the lights off? Is this good? You do sometimes see glimpses of the audiences, which is very interesting. This is Kathy Berberian, the American, very important American experimentalist.
Good grief!
Iranian Orchestra.
It's quite natural that the Terran Orchestra should want to play Western music. It's a Western-based orchestra, and it's quite natural that they should want to show what they can do.
Singing Carmen by night, or French ballet by day, the ruins of Persepolis make a unique background.
La dernière aire...
Oui. Nanana.
Moi, je vais loin. Non, non, un peu. Ah bon.
These are all from 1968, and this is the Moscow Harp Quartet. The Kathakali dancers from India. Here they're being made up. It's a very ritualistic way of making up itself.
My point of view is more sentimental than professional. I think that we should keep our traditional music. And of course, I think that the influence of the Western music will be
the whole country and all this group of mostly younger people who are interested in the arts and in the future of Iran are trying to work against this westernization.
My first encounter with Persian traditional music was the most exciting thing I think that's happened so far. It's an excitement which has been repeated night after night, but there was the sudden first impact of this very fine art. A marvelous tar player. I've heard several others since.
Yes,
none of
can you
them,
remember his name? I would have looked it up if I had the time, but the guitar player on the first night. Oh, God, it's only over there.
Most marvelous.
Stretch across and find it. I will stretch across and find it. Did you hear the Russian harvest?
Yes.
You did?
4 powder pigeons, sitting and playing the most ghastly arrangements for 4 harps of the Minuet by Boccherini is just too camp for me. I mean, I can't understand how they can send them out as artistic representatives.
If we can have number 2, Besmela Khan, please. This is a performance by Besmela Khan at Hafizieh. Just want to say something before I go on, that as we see already in 1968, the very kind of panoramic view of the world culture, and the kind of placing these articulations next to each other. But in affirming non-European sensibilities, there's a very interesting point to talk about here. The Shiraz-Persepolis Festival identified and tapped into a repository where non-European expressions were highly developed. In 1969, they came up with the theme of percussion. And in doing so, they were able to propose Asian and African expressions as sophisticated, valid, and possibly equal, even perhaps sometimes more sophisticated than the European expressions in percussion. They talk about rhythm as the most fundamental ingredient of all music. It signifies a return to basics, and it resonates with elemental instinctual drives, something that is very complex. I'm not going to articulate too much about that, but this whole notion of instinctual drives going against text, going against cultural specificities is very, very important in Shiraz, and I think it's not very well understood, especially by many of our intellectuals at the time, I think, who were much more interested in poetry, literature, political criticism, and very importantly so. But I think these concepts, which are very rooted in performance, are quite complex, but they are definitely articulated within the catalogs themselves. So here, what they did in 1969 is that they used a theme which allowed them for a fluid programming that included Naqare Khane from Iran and even Zurkhane. So they brought the Zurkhane performers into the ruins of Takht Jamshid. The Rwanda Drum Ensemble, Balinese gamelan concerts, Iranian concerts by Hossein Tehrani and Payvar and Shemirani, American jazz percussionist Max Roach, the French-Greek experimentalist Yanis Xenakis, who performed with the Strasbourg Percussion Orchestra, and it was a commission called Persefasa. This is all in 1967. And we can see a few of these, if we can please quickly go to number 5. Yes. The gamelan concert by the Balinese was accompanied by dance, in this case. I could shorten these pieces if you want me to. Zurkhane, number 6. Next one. This is another clip from the Balinese. Note the local population coming to watch the rehearsals. And reacting to the music is quite incredible. So another interesting one is the next year after that, 1970, is the idea of ritual. The festival comes up with another kind of universalizing notion, which is called theater and ritual. It's a means or an idea to intersect various archaic, primitive, primordial rituals with contemporary avant-garde experiments. It investigated and promised the release of universal ecstatic powers, insight into the unconscious world of the collective, on the basis that it brought theater closer to its essence, ideals of catharsis and the connection with the emotional core of drama were the unifying drives behind this kind of idea. So here they put together a wide variety of artists, Jerzy Grotowski with The Constant Prince, the adaptation of Gorgani's Visoramin, which is an 11th century text, which is adapted by Mahin Tajaddud, which already has its roots in Pahlavi texts. It was directed by Arbi Ovanessian. Jean Genet's The Maids, Les Bonnes, it was directed by Victor Garcia from Argentina, performed by the Spanish Nuria Espert group. Fire, Bread and Puppet, American Theater, as well as a Tazieh of Moslem Aqil. These coming together as ritual under that theme. Let me see what a few other things. Could we have number 9, please? Actually, can we have number 10? Sorry. This is a clip showing the kind of performance Jerzy Grotowski, a very influential Polish practitioner. I know this material is a bit specialist, but Number 9. We've got a few pieces of music. Not that one, next one. Yep.
With the afternoon raga known as Madhuvanti. First, there will be a very short solo on the sitar, followed by a cut. That's where the drums join.
Terrible thing to cut music in the middle, I know. Can we have the other one, Australum?
May we ested our existence 100 years, e fiorito il giardino. Yea, even more than 100 years. Lovely by nature, announce Hinton's love when shown by loving maidens as messengers to attract lovers. The mango trees but fills my heart with strong desire for my lover, as does the cry of the cuckoos drunken with love.
This piece was commissioned by the festival, and it's multilingual, including Persian, German, French, Italian, and it's they're all based on texts by anonymous Persian poets. It's a kind of one of the type of projects that the festival would undertake. And it was the closing ceremony of 1971. What you're seeing here is more or less chronological. Apart from one of them, they're all chronological. Go to the next one, please. 1973. Yeah. Number 14. I've got two more to show you. it's just quickly having a look at this. This is not a footage from Iran, but it's the masked dancers of Bhutan. As it's in chronology, I put it at it's coming towards the end. It happened in the Jahan Nama garden. There's another bit of it, right? Can we? Yeah. So these are not in Iran, but it's just to show you the kind of ceremonial and ritualistic performances that the festival gave a lot of importance to. And I want to finish with the piece from 1977, the last year. This is the Sheda ensemble with leader as Lotfi and on the tar as well. That's him. And Siavash Mohammad Reza Shajarian singing. Nava mode. So that's the end of my talk. I'll be happy to take some comments and questions. If is that the format, John? All right. Okay.